Welcome back. I'm Jim Sabanius, and I will be co-moderating with my friend and colleague, Professor Nick Burns of the Kennedy School. And of course, for the great majority of you who were here for the first session, Ambassador Tommy Koh. We are joined and honored by the presence of Singapore's ambassador to the US, the Honorable Karen Tan. UN, sorry. So I'm going to let the diplomats introduce the diplomats. So last time we focused on the art and science and craft of multilateral conference diplomacy and got a lot of insights into how to handle many of the challenges that they present. We're going to take something more of a bilateral focus this time, although not strictly speaking, because very few negotiations, in fact, are bilateral, even where it's two countries. The number of interested parties internally and externally and on each side tend to multiply. So we'll start with a few minutes on the Singapore-US Free Trade Agreement, of which Ambassador Koh was the chief negotiator. And we'll start with Singapore, which had a free trade agreement with the United States, indeed with a number of other countries, as a significant strategic priority. But for the United States, Singapore was pretty low in the queue of free trade deals to be realized. So the question is, how did this process start?
It's a very romantic story. First, I should explain that there's a long queue of countries that wish to negotiate free trade agreements with the United States. We were on the queue. We were not at the head of the queue, but neither were we at the end of the queue, because although Singapore is a small country, but we're a big economy and a very significant economic partner of the United States. I don't remember exactly now, but we rank, I think, maybe 16th largest trading partner with the United States, or even higher. We are one of the largest trading partners of the United States. The United States has more FDI in Singapore than in any ASEAN country. There's a very large community of US businesses in Singapore. And according to one Department of Commerce study, return on investment in Singapore outperformed US investment anywhere else in the world. So it's a very profitable economic partner. So we are not insignificant, you know. But there is a romantic story about how we managed to jump the queue to be at the head of the queue. In the United States, there's an orderly process for deciding who will be at the head of the queue. And the orderly process would begin, I guess, usually in Nick's former Department of State, or in USTR, or in consultations with USTR, Department of State, Department of Commerce, something like that. And the National Security Council has a major say, because they coordinate all the inputs from all the agencies, and then they make a recommendation to the president. We were not at the head of the queue. How did we manage to be at the head of the queue? And this is the romantic story. We had an American ambassador to Singapore, not from the Foreign Service, but from the private sector, and his name was Steve Green, who had made his fortune, I think, with Samsonite, which he then sold. And then Steve was one of those people we call FOB, Friends of Bill, you know. So he had a direct line to the White House. The bureaucrats don't like such people because they are difficult to control. But the USTR at the time is a wonderful woman called Charlene Bashevsky, who's, I think, a winner of the award, right? Charlene liked Singapore. And she had a different view about the priority that ought to be accorded to Singapore than the State Department and the White House. So Charlene Barshevsky was on the way to Brunei to attend the APEC summit, November 2000. And she stopped in Singapore on the way. When she stopped in Singapore, Steve Green managed to pull Charlene aside and say, Charlene, this is the last opportunity before the Clinton administration's mandate runs out in January for us to launch an FTA with Singapore. And Steve brought Charlene to see my Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, both of which said, good idea about how to do it, And this is a conspiracy. The conspiracy was not to let Nick know, but Charlene Barshevsky would go to Brunei, and he would work with my Foreign Minister, George Yeo, and they would brief Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong to say, find an opportunity to talk to President Clinton directly, but don't let Madeleine Albright or Sandy Berger know. Because Sandy Albright and Madeleine Albright and Sandy Berger will certainly say no. There's an orderly process for deciding who should be the next FTA partner. It's not Singapore. So Prime Minister Goh approached President Clinton at the APEC banquet held in this grand istana in Brunei and said, President, shall we play a game of golf after the state banquet? And this banquet ended at close to midnight, So they started playing golf after a thunderstorm at midnight. And the game ended at 2 a.m. in the morning. And while they were having coffee, my then PM made a pitch to President Clinton and say, you have FTAs with Israel, with Jordan. Your predecessor, Jimmy Carter, had proposed an FTA of the whole of the Americas, But you have none with Asia. Asia is so important strategically and economically to the United States. Why don't you do one with Singapore? We are an easy country to do an FTA with because we're an open economy, and you can use us as the template to negotiate with other Asian countries. Well, President Clinton was convinced at 2 a.m. in the morning. And so later that morning when they met at the APEC summit, Prime Minister Goh sent a draft of a press statement announcing that the two countries would launch an FTA. And Bill Clinton, with very nice handwriting, amended this, and the press statement was issued that morning. And I was standing on the bank of this beautiful West Lake in Hangzhou, because I was teaching at the Hangzhou University Zhejiang University in Hangzhou. And so I had a phone call from my mobile from my boss, George Yeo, to say, Prime Minister and the President have just agreed to launch an FTA negotiation. Are you willing to be the chief negotiator? I said, boy, I tried to achieve this in my 6 years in Washington and I feel I would love to be the chief negotiator. That's how it all began.
You notice how nervous this is making Nick? So you got this process going.
Yeah.
And there was the back and forth, and of course, Ralph Ives was chosen as your counterpart. Then the Clinton administration replaced by the Bush administration with Bob Zoellick as George Yo's counterpart.
But frankly, President Clinton had misled Prime Minister Goh. He said in Brunei that we can complete the negotiation in 2 months. Yeah, he said all we have to do is follow the US-Jordan template. And my Prime Minister believed him and said to me, Tommy, you compose the Singapore delegation and go off to Washington and get the job done before you come home. And I said, Prime Minister, it's not so simple, Under US law, you have to notify Congress, which had no knowledge and was very angry about it. You have to notify the public, and then you've got to solicit feedback, you've got to evaluate the feedback. I said the whole thing will take months, There's just no way in which we could have completed an FTA with the Clinton administration in 2 months. I was right. So what do I do during this interregnum? I used that time productively by reaching out to my Republican friends, because I was very afraid that the initiative by Clinton would be rebuffed by the incoming Bush administration. There was a certain attitude on the part of the incoming administration to reject everything that Bill did, anything but Bill was one of their mantras, So I reached out to our old friends in the Republican Party who were very likely to hold office in the next administration. We reached out to Bob Zoellick, Paul Wolfowitz, Jim Kelly, and many, many others. And they assured us that this is an initiative by the Clinton administration which will have continued support by the Bush administration. So we were very reassured. And then we for those who believe in God, prayed that maybe President Bush will pick Bob Zoellick to be the next USTR, which did happen. So.
And you got advice from Ambassador Steve Green that leave the internal U.S. process to the U.S. side. And how did you deal with that advice?
Well, first I had a great ambassador in Washington, another woman, Chan Heng-chi, who really knew America well. And I had spent 20 years of my life in America and knew how the American democracy worked. So I did not accept Ambassador Stephen Green's advice. Just concentrate on negotiating the agreement and take care of the ratification process subsequently. No. Ambassador Chan and I embarked on a campaign. The campaign is the right word to use. We embarked on a campaign, not only to negotiate with the executive branch of the US government, which is not just USTR, not just state, but Treasury, Agriculture, and so on, many, many agencies. But we also kept the US Congress informed, in the loop. It was important that key members of the Congress were comfortable with the negotiation. It was important for us to know in advance if they had problems so that we could address them. So we were simultaneously negotiating with Congress. Third, we were not negotiating, but we were touching base with all the business interests. The American Chamber of Commerce, Manufacturers Association, all the business interests that would be affected by the FTA. Movie industry, music industry, software industry, financial services. We touched base with everybody. And we even touched base with the media and the NGOs. So we wanted to build a coalition to support what we were doing. And Ambassador Chan did two other things which were very, very good, which is that she created a pro-Singapore caucus in the US Congress. And she also got together all the big American businesses that had a stake in Singapore and formed a business coalition for the FTA. So it was a multi-pronged campaign and not just negotiating an FTA with the United States.
In your description of this process, you said that early on you were concerned about a, quote, nightmare scenario. Could you describe what that was and what you did about it?
Yeah. My nightmare scenario, Nick, was that if three interest groups were to coalesce against me, organized labor, AFL-CIO, the human rights lobby, and the Green Movement, if these three powerful interest groups were to join hands and oppose Singapore, then I would have a very serious obstacle to overcome, We were lucky in that the human rights lobby were not very interested in the FTA and took no position. Fortunately, my green credentials were pretty good, having chaired the PrepCom for the Earth Summit and the negotiations of the Earth Summit. So So Nature Conservancy, IUCN, WWF, Sierra Club, all love me, you know. So they see me as a good guy, and they were not concerned that the FTA would be damaging to the environment. My main problem was AFL-CIO. Because the AFL-CIO, as a matter of ideology, is protectionist and anti-free trade. And as a matter of principle, they oppose all FTAs. But during my 6 years in Washington, I had reached out to Elaine Kirkland at AFL-CIO and began a sort of relationship with them. You know, so I was not a stranger to AFL-CIO. So during the 2 years when we were negotiating the FTA, I renewed my relationship with AFL-CIO, convinced them to send a fact-finding mission to Singapore to see for themselves that we don't oppress our workers, that we allow them to unionize, that we don't have a minimum wage, but we have something that works, which is a National Wages Council, which is a tripartite body representing workers, employers, and the government, and that wages of the workers have been rising over the years in a way commensurate with our growing prosperity. So the AFL-CIO's fact-finding mission to Singapore was relatively positive. They came back to Washington with a good report. And then I negotiated a gentleman's understanding with AFL-CIO. I said, I know that you cannot support the FTA because on principle you're opposed to all FTA. But what I want from you are two things. One, that you don't campaign against us. And second, you don't call upon members of the Congress who are beholden to you to vote against us. And that I got from AFL-CIO. So I managed to diffuse what would have been a nightmare scenario, you know?
So really, we haven't spoken about your internal Singapore front of this campaign, but there was that, the executive branch, the Congress, the business community, other elements of civil society, active on all of these to bring together what was ultimately signed and ratified. It's a very different conception of two principals negotiating across the table, and it's done. It's just a very different world and quite elegant. Nick, would you like to take a different tack?
I'd be happy to, but perhaps what I should do first is say how happy I am to see Ambassador Tommy Koh here. I had to miss the first session because I was teaching, but some of my class members our students have come over, and I'm really pleased that Harvard can honor you, Tommy,
Thank you, Nick.
in the way that we have as our Great Negotiator 2014. I will just say a word about Harvard, famously decentralized university. And yet here we have the law school in the person of our friend Professor Bob Mnookin, and the business school with Professor Jim Sebanius, and the Kennedy School combining on this project on negotiation. And we're really proud that the three schools work together. And we're conducting together another project. We were all together last Monday at Stanford to interview Secretary of State George Shultz. We spent the day with him, and we're going to be interviewing all the living secretaries of state with the intention of producing a book and teaching material and case studies and maybe even a documentary on great negotiators in the American system. And in that vein, you can teach us a lot about the Americans, how you perceive the American negotiating strategy in the course of this interview. Let me just change the subject if I could, if that's okay.
I'm only going to amend this by one small piece.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the multiple schools at Harvard, but it's even more than
Fletcher
that.
School.
MIT, Fletcher, Brandeis.
Yep.
This is remarkable. So Tommy, you're a unifying force. In any case.
So Tommy, I wanted to take you to your home region, to Asia,
and
ask you a series of questions about about contemporary politics, and how you think some of the most acute differences among the states of Asia can be resolved. And I'm going to start with the South China Sea, an issue you know well. From our perspective here in the United States, you have China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, just to name a few of the countries, with overlapping territorial claims in the South China Sea. You have the assertion by China, and it was actually the predecessor government to Mao's government that surfaced this in the 1940s of the 9-dash line. And you have a situation where ASEAN is beginning to try to make sense of these and provide a home, a place, a forum for not formal adjudication of the disputes, but a meeting place for perhaps a resolution of some of them. Is ASEAN ready for that role? Is ASEAN the right institution to play that role? Or do you think that another institution needs to be developed to adjudicate these problems over a long-term basis? Because they will be with you, I think, for a long time to come.
Okay. I want to contextualize the South China Sea. South China Sea is only a part of a very much larger agenda in the relations between the People's Republic of China and ASEAN. And I want to say the overall relationship between China and the ASEAN country is a very positive one. Yeah. China is a major trading partner of almost all the ASEAN countries. China is the largest provider of ODA now to the ASEAN countries. China is not yet the largest FDI investor in ASEAN, but is rapidly catching up on Japan and the United States. So China is a very important partner of Southeast Asia. And we in Southeast Asia view the rise of China in a positive way. We think that a China that is strong and prosperous is not only good for the Chinese people, but it is also good for China's neighbors. And the Chinese have been very generous in offering ASEAN a good FTA, good early harvest that enable us to gain access to the great Chinese economy. This is on the positive side. But when you are a country as big as China, country of continental scale, when you become strong and powerful, you naturally create anxiety on the part of your neighbors. Your neighbors would wonder whether a powerful China will continue to practice the policy of good neighborliness that we've seen in Southeast Asia for so many decades. People in Southeast Asia wonder, does Deng Xiaoping's advice, keep a low profile, hide your lights, continue to prevail? Or has China abandoned that doctrine and now has taken a different direction? It's an open question. When I'm in Beijing, I often say to my Chinese friends that as you become stronger and more powerful, you should learn to act with self-restraint. You should avoid giving the impression to your neighbors that you have become a regional bully. You should try to uphold the rule of law and ensure that what you do is in strict compliance with international law and the international rules of conduct between and among nations. So I want to give you this general backdrop before I talk about the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a very important part of the global commons. It's part of the Pacific Ocean. It is very important for trade, for shipping, for navigation by military ships and aircraft. It is a very important and strategic part of the world. In the South China Sea, there are small islands, rocks, and shoals. 4 countries, namely Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and China, have made sovereignty claims to to these rocks and islands. So there are conflicting claims of sovereignty, and there are overlapping claims of sovereignty. So the question is, how do you resolve this? Well, rationally, there are two ways to resolve this. You could resolve it in a non-legal cooperative way, or you could resolve it in a legal way. So let me talk about the non-legal cooperative way first. Many years ago, when Deng Xiaoping was the de facto leader of China, he was a very wise man. He said, both about South China Sea and the East China Sea, that sovereignty disputes over territory are so difficult to resolve. Let us be wise and put them aside for resolution in the future. In the meantime, why don't we agree to jointly develop the resources of the disputed areas? So a non-legal cooperative way forward is for China and Philippines, China and Vietnam, China, Malaysia, China, Brunei to look at the possibility of joint development. Why is this not happening? Well, it's not happening because the Chinese have not clarified their claims. You cannot have joint development unless you can identify what is the specific area that you wish to jointly develop. The Chinese have been unclear on exactly what are they claiming. They wrote out this KMT map of 1947. Initially, it had 9 lines. 2 were removed when China and Vietnam managed to settle the boundaries in the Gulf of Tonkin. So there are 9 lines. What we in Southeast Asia are not very clear is, what is the specific nature of the Chinese claim? Are the Chinese saying, we claim sovereignty to all the islands, rocks, and shoals within the 9 lines? Or are the Chinese saying something more, that we have a right to the fish, to the oil and gas resources in the continental shelf enclosed by these 9 lines? So the Chinese have not been clear. Because if they were saying the first, then this is consistent with international law, but the Chinese have to prove their sovereignty. But if they're saying the second, then we must respectfully ask our Chinese friends, on what legal basis? On what legal basis are you making this claim? So, joint development is not possible until the Chinese clarify their claim, and we know exactly what are the disputed areas. What about the non-cooperative legal solution? There are many, Let me mention several of them. You could have conciliation. You could have arbitration. You could have adjudication. There is among certain Asian cultures a reluctant to take a friend to court. It goes back to the Confucianist philosophy. And there is, I think, in China, in Japan, in Korea, a certain cultural disinclination to take a friend to court to settle the dispute. And it is quite remarkable that although China, Japan, and Korea have judges, either in ICJ or ITLAW, they have never initiated a case in any of those courts. It's remarkable. So, one way is conciliation. Conciliation is culturally comfortable to Asians. How does conciliation work? Well, it works like this. And I'll give you a specific case. Some years ago, there was a conflict between Iceland and Norway over the continental shelf. They decided to constitute a conciliation commission. So Norway appointed one person, Iceland appointed another person, and the 2 of them appointed an American, Elliot Richardson, to be the neutral chairman. And the 3 of them, the 3 wise men, managed to make a compromise proposal on how the continental shelf between Iceland and Norway should be delimited, which was accepted by both sides. Conciliation is a very soft option that Asians would like. The other option is arbitration. Take it to arbitration. India and Bangladesh can't agree on how to draw their maritime boundaries. But India and Bangladesh have agreed consensually to refer the dispute to arbitration under UNCLOS. A third way is adjudication. And we in Southeast Asia seem to be less Confucianist than the Northeast Asians, So there are many examples of countries in Southeast Asia taking disputes, territorial dispute to court. Thailand and Cambodia took a dispute over this Hindu temple, Preah Vihear, to ICJ in 1962, but the residue is still haunting them. Indonesia and Malaysia took a dispute, 2 islands, Litigan and Sipadan to ICJ. Singapore and Malaysia took a dispute over Pedrabangka to ICJ. So adjudication is a viable legal option. Philippines has unilaterally taken China to arbitration.
Just recently.
Recently. The Chinese have refused to participate because the Chinese national policy at the moment is we will not refer any sovereignty dispute over territory to a third party. And I would like to use this opportunity to make a sincere appeal to my Chinese brothers and sisters that you should rethink this policy. As China grows in power, your neighbors would naturally want to know, will a powerful China be a law-abiding China? Will you accept the rule of law, or do you intend to impose a rule of force? It is important for the Chinese to be willing, on a case-by-case basis, to refer some of your territorial sovereignty dispute to conciliation, to arbitration, and to adjudication. To do so would, I think, give substance to the Chinese doctrine that your rise in the world will be a peaceful one. But if you refuse to do this, and you wish to solve the problem by what I call action on the ground, fait accompli, then I would say people will begin to wonder, is the Chinese rise really peaceful? So there's a long answer to your short question.
Long but good answer and very enlightening. I have 2 quick follow-up questions. Then I want to move, if you're willing, to complicate your life, to the East China Sea. The 2 follow-up questions. One is just a factual question. Do you believe that the 9-dash line is consistent with the law of the sea?
I am not willing to answer that. Because it's sub judice, it's before the arbitral tribunal. The arbitral tribunal has been constituted, although the Chinese refused to participate, but under UNCLOS, under Annex 7, an arbitral tribunal of 5 very distinguished international lawyers, with a Ghanaian international lawyer, Tom Mensah, as chairman, has been constituted. And they are meeting right now. The first question they will address is, do we have jurisdiction? The second question they answer is there any basis in international law to support the Chinese map with the 9-dash lines? So the issue is sub judice, and I think it would be inappropriate for me to answer that question.
Yeah, and I respect that. However, would you agree, Tommy, that the Chinese claim is, in international political and legal terms, ambitious?
I would put it differently. I would say, as a former president of the Law of the Sea Conference, I cry at night when I think of the amount of cheating taking place by states parties. There's very little integrity in this world, I'm sorry to tell you. very, very little integrity in this world. Countries that are not entitled to draw straight baseline do so with no compunction, no shame, Little rocks which are not capable of sustaining human life or economic life, human habitation. The claimants say, no, it's not a rock, it's an island. And they build all kinds of artificial structures to enhance that claim, forgetting that under international law, everything you do doesn't change the original status of the feature, There's a lot of cheating taking place. Coastal states are trying to territorialize the exclusive economic zone. The economic zone is not part of your territorial sea. Of course, it's neither a high sea, it has a sui generis status. And apart from the coastal state's sovereign rights to exploit the economic resources of the economic zone, high seas freedom prevail in the economic zone. But many coastal states refuse to accept that. They are not honest in the implementation of the law. So it is another example of what I call excessive claims by states. One of my wild dreams is to co-convene with the UN an annual conference on the implementation of UNCLOS, and to be the whistleblower and to say, sorry guys, your claim is excessive, it is not in accordance with the law. And this is not just China, it's also, I told the Vietnamese in private, you have no right to draw straight baselines. And I've told, other friends, better not mention too many names. But it is really sad. I feel very sad when I see what's going on in terms of state practice. The state practice is that if the feature is mine, it's an island. If it's yours, it's a rock. And no better example than this dispute we had with Malaysia over Pedra Bangka. Malaysia used to call Pedra Bangka in Malay, Pulau Batu Putih, meaning the white rock island. The moment they lost the case, in all their maps, they deleted the word Pulau or island. So the moment they lost the case, the island suddenly became only a rock, So I asked my Malaysian friends, how come? If you had won the case, it's an island, and you lost the case, it suddenly became a rock, So this is my point. My point is that it is a very sad reflection on human nature that there is so little integrity in this world, and there are so many excessive claims by coastal states, and many erroneous assertions of rights and jurisdiction which are not consistent with the law.
Okay. Before we move to East China Sea, which is a difficult problem, one follow-up question on South China Sea. There was a very tense, dramatic exchange, I think at the ASEAN Regional Forum 2010, between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her Chinese counterpart, then the Chinese foreign minister.
In Hanoi, I remember.
So the United States asserted itself in this meeting by effectively saying to the Chinese, you need to respect the rights, legal and others, of some of the other Southeast Asian states, and there ought to be a process to which China submits herself. The Chinese were furious with the United States for that exchange. What's the proper role of the United States? We're not a South China Sea country, but some of the South China Sea littoral states privately will say to the United States, please keep your Navy and Air Force in this region. Please maintain your alliance system because we want you to balance China. How serious is this interaction between China and the United States in your judgment? And what advice do you have for Americans?
Yeah. Again, I want to enlarge the question to talk about the great importance, not just to the two countries, but to the whole world of Sino-American relations. I think I don't know whether Graham Allison is here. He was here earlier today. But Graham had written an op-ed in the Financial Times, I think last year, in which he said He had looked at world history and counted that I think maybe there were 15 occasions in world history when an incumbent power is faced with a rising power. And he said in 11 of those 15 cases, it ended in war, you know. So a question that many thoughtful people around the world are asking is, are we watching a situation in which an incumbent power, the United States, is faced with a rising power? And will the two countries have the wisdom to manage this relationship without it ending in war? Yeah. I think all of us, not just Americans and Chinese, all of us have a stake in peace between the United States and China. We don't want a Sino-American war, and we in Southeast Asia and East Asia do not want even a Sino-American Cold War. Yeah? We want President Obama, President Xi Jinping to manage this relationship with maturity and with wisdom. Yeah? And there are many issues on the bilateral agenda. South China Sea is just one of them. Yeah. Now, so what is the appropriate thing for the United States to say and do? What Secretary Clinton said in Hanoi was not wrong, which is that, if I may summarize my memory, I may get it wrong. Let me summarize my memory, what Secretary Hillary Clinton said. The United States is not a claimant country in the South China Sea. Second, the United States does not take sides on the merit of the claims by the 5 claimant countries. Third, the United States is a stakeholder in the South China Sea because we want these disputes to be resolved peacefully without threatening peace. Fourth, the United States wants all the interested parties to conduct themselves strictly in accordance with international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And fifth, the United States has a strategic interest in freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. I think it was not wrong for Secretary Clinton to say that. I'm not sure why my good friend, the then Foreign Minister, now State Councilor, Yang Jieqi, reacted so emotionally. But maybe he was taken by surprise. Maybe as a good diplomat, one ought to let your opposite number know in advance that I'm going to make for the first time, and it was the first time, I'm going to make for the first time an important policy statement on the South China Sea, so that Yang Jieqi is not caught by surprise, which somehow destabilized him, you know. And he, in my view, overreacted, and his response was too emotional, too aggressive. It didn't go down well with the ASEAN countries. So I would say that in that exchange, I thought State Councilor Yang overreacted.
And we don't know whether or not Secretary Clinton or Assistant Secretary of State Kurt Campbell had alerted the Chinese in advance. I agree with you, that would have been the proper thing. Yeah. But I just don't know whether they did or not. Let me move to the East China Sea, because I think in American eyes, it's a more acute crisis for us. I think Washington worries that China and Japan, second and third largest economies in the world, probably in a way second and third largest and most important military powers in the world, that neither wants to go to war with each other. Both are rational governments, strong-willed leaders, but they don't want war. The risk may be mistake or miscalculation by some of a lieutenant, a captain in a patrol boat or an aircraft that could spark a conflict. What's the right way to diffuse the crisis, separate the two parties? What is the role for Asian countries in this? What's the role of the United States? We're in a delicate position because we do not recognize Japanese sovereignty as far as I understand the Senkakus, but we do represent their administrative control.
Yes.
Recognize that because we transferred the islands to them in 1972. And we are a treaty ally, defense ally, and Washington has said in the last few months the Senkaku Islands are covered by the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. This is a very difficult situation for three countries, China, Japan, and the United States. As a veteran diplomat, how would you recommend that the three of them find a way to back off and handle this in a very mature, peaceful manner?
I think the current situation is totally unnecessary. In 1972, when after the Japanese had recovered from the Nixon shoku, the Prime Minister Tanaka immediately went to Beijing to try to normalize relations between the two countries. The Chinese were very generous in the way that they dealt with Japan in 1972. They did not ask for reparations. They didn't make a big deal about what happened in China during the war. Both Mao and Deng Xiaoping were very forward-looking to say, let us concentrate on our convergent interests. As for the territorial disputes, two sides agreed to put them aside, And there was a certain code of conduct about how to deal with each other if a Chinese fishing ship intruded into waters around Senkaku, Diaoyi, the Japanese would just arrest them and send them off. And peace prevailed. Peace prevailed. So what changed? What changed was a few years ago, the governor of Tokyo, Shintaro Ishihara, who's a troublemaker in my view. I'm in big trouble. He wanted to buy two of the islands from a family that allegedly owned them. This would have complicated things, It would have been a violation from the understanding that had prevailed since 1972. And so the DPJ government that was then in power and didn't have much experience of dealing with China decided we can't let Ishihara do this. And the then Prime Minister Noda decided to preempt Ishihara by nationalizing the island. To the Chinese perspective, you have completely altered the status of this island. They were in a gray area, ambiguous, disputed between the two of us, and we've agreed to live with the status quo and postpone the resolution to the future. And here you are, you nationalize the islands. And the other thing the DPJ government did, which caused a lot of problems, is that when the captain of a Chinese fishing vessel, quite an aggressive fellow, Captain Zhang, rammed into two Japanese Coast Guard boats. The Japanese arrested him, brought him to a Japanese port, and threatened to prosecute him under Japanese law. To the Chinese, this is a no-no. This is again a departure from precedent. In the past, you arrest them and you send them back to China. But here you arrested them, you brought them back to Japan, you're going to prosecute him under Japanese law. So the Chinese perspective is the understanding of 72 has been broken, both by the nationalization of the island by Noda and by this attempt to prosecute Captain Zhang under Japanese law. This is why the Chinese reacted so, in my view, emotionally, And then the emergence of Prime Minister Abe has not reduced the tension but increased it, because they see Prime Minister Abe as someone who's a right-wing nationalist, and his visit to Yasukuni Shrine is viewed both by China and Korea as an insult to the memories of the victims of Japanese aggression. They see his attempt to revise the Constitution and to reinterpret Article 9 as a dangerous signal. They see his earlier announcement, which is now retracted, to amend the Kono statement on the comfort woman and what's the name of the Prime Minister statement on the Second World War, as another sign of Japan going right, becoming more nationalistic and militaristic. So things are very bad now between China and Japan. I just don't know what we can do to reduce the tension. The Chinese leaders refuse to talk to Abe. The Americans can't play a helpful role because they don't see you as neutral. The Chinese don't see you as neutral. The Chinese know that you have a treaty obligation to Japan. Right. They know that you made a distinction between not recognizing sovereignty but recognizing administration. But then you've said your treaty obligation to defend Japan include the Senkaku Diaoyu, So to the American, you are not a neutral party, but worse, in spite of sunny lands, there's such a huge deficit of trust between Washington and Beijing that my interlocutors in Beijing think that you are the puppet master behind all these moves by China's neighbor to make trouble for China. They think that you're behind Japan and you're behind the Philippines. And I try to tell my Chinese friend that this is not the case, that if the Chinese don't want war with Japan because you will inevitably get involved, that the Philippines acted on their own volition, maybe even without President Obama's support, but the Philippines were determined that for a small country, there's no other means to defend itself but through law. But the Americans think that you are behind, you are the puppet master. To use an Indonesian word, they think that you are the dalang, that you are pulling all these strings.
So this brings us back to Nick's question. You've painted a pretty scary picture. What should who do to either lead to some sort of lessening of tension? Is there a role for ASEAN in this? How can wiser heads prevail? What kind of actions might lead to a better solution than appears to be the current course?
Well, next month in May, I've been invited by the Koreans to speak at a conference in Jeju Island on territorial disputes in Northeast Asia. I'm sharing a perspective from Southeast Asia. It's a futile mission, but my wife told me, why are you wasting your time? But I think it may be a futile mission, but I want to go to Korea. I want to say to China, Japan, and Korea that there are lessons they can learn from Southeast Asia. Lesson number one. In Northeast Asia, countries which are in possession of disputed territory, whether it be Japan in the case of Senkaku Diaoyu, or Korea in the case of Dokdo Takashima, will say, there's no dispute. What dispute are you talking about? This is absurd, I mean, in private, I tell my Japanese friend, the whole world knows there is a dispute between you and China over Senkaku and Diaoyu, and why are you saying there's no dispute? They say, well, we're in possession of the island. And then at the same time, you expect the Koreans to accept your request to refer your dispute over Dokdo Takashima to take it to the court. They are behaving just like you. They say, we're in possession of Dokdo. Why should we acknowledge that there's a dispute? So I say, why don't you follow Singapore's example? We were in possession of Pedra Branca for hundreds of years until Malaysia made a claim in 1979. We could have behaved in the way the Japanese and Koreans are doing now, to say there's no dispute. The Malaysian claim is frivolous, there's no merit. But do we do that? No. We feel that it's better to solve the issue than to have it as a constant irritant in our bilateral relation. And worse, run the dangers that some hot-headed guy in a ship or aircraft may shoot at the other guy and escalate it. So we took the initiative to say to the Malaysian, since you think you have a case, why don't we consensually agree to refer this dispute to the International Court of Justice? I wish China and Japan would agree to refer the dispute over Senkaku Diaoyi to the court. I wish Japan and Korea would agree to refer the dispute over Dr. Takashima to the court. And if they find that they can't do this, then I say, go back to the status quo ante, you know? Nick, you may remember, not so many years ago, President Hu Jintao had a very successful visit to Japan. The then Prime Minister of Japan was Fukuda. And the two leaders concluded several very important agreements, one of which is to turn the East China Sea into a sea of peace and cooperation, including joint development of the resources of the East China Sea, you know. So I would remind my Chinese and Japanese friends that, hey, only a few years ago, your two leaders signed this agreement, you know. So why are you now indulging in escalation of saber rattling, you know, of threatening peace in the whole region?
Thank you. We do want to go to questions from our students and from others here. I just have one last question. We've talked about China a lot here, and of course you, and of course your extraordinary leader, Lee Kuan Yew, have a lot of experience living with the Chinese, working with the Chinese, trying to manage a difficult relationship between a smaller country and a larger country. One of the most important things we can do at this university, faculty, staff, but especially students, is to be smarter about China, to understand the Chinese tradition, to make sure that we're going to be peaceful partners. What advice do you have for us about the Chinese tradition in negotiations, about Chinese, is there a Chinese custom or tradition that we should be mindful of as we sit down with the Chinese on difficult issues?
I think it's important for all of us, not just Americans, but to all the rest of us, to have a better and deeper understanding of Chinese history and culture. I think very few of us have made a deep study of Chinese history and culture. I was invited by the CPPCC. It's one of these institutions in Beijing that has a lot of money and holds a very high-profile annual conference. One year they invited me to come and speak on China and the world. And I took the opportunity to immerse myself in Chinese history, to try to understand how the Chinese view the world, you know. And in my study of Chinese history, I discovered, to my surprise, that in their long history, most of the time, the Chinese have been victims of aggression by others. First, it was the nomadic tribes from the north, and then the Mongols during the Yuan dynasty that ruled them, and then the Manchus that ruled them during the Qing dynasty, 300 years. And then maybe 100 to 150 years when China was weak and it was bullied, not just by the Western powers, but also by Japan. And so it's a sad history, actually, you know. So, and I asked myself, was there any period in Chinese history when China was an aggressive and an expansionist power? I think there were only two periods, you know. Both periods when China was ruled by foreigners. When China was ruled by the Mongols during the Yuan dynasty, China was an aggressive expansionist power. Yuan China tried to invade Japan twice. And each time, they were defeated by the winds, which the Japanese call kamikaze, divine wind. The Mongols even tried to conquer Java, Borobudur, you know. And when the king of Pagan refused to pay tribute to Kublai Khan, they sent the golden hordes and destroyed Pagan, you know. So Yuan China was an aggressive expansionist state. But Ming China was not. When the Han Chinese ruled China, Ming China, like Tang China, had this middle kingdom complex, that we are the greatest civilization in the world, you know. We have no desires to conquer foreign territories and people. But we are so great that you will naturally want to come and pay respect and tribute to me. And for every gift you give me, I give you 10 in return. This is the way the Chinese behave towards the world. China under the Manchu was, of course, different. And the Qing dynasty was an expansionist. And territories like Tibet, Xinjiang, you know, were conquered by China during the Qing dynasty. So my sort of general wisdom reading Chinese history is that it is not in the Chinese DNA. It is not in the Chinese DNA to be an expansionist, aggressive power. But what the Chinese want is to be recognized by the world as a great power. What the Chinese want is a seat at the top table. What the Chinese want is to be treated especially by the United States, because they think that they are your co-equal. They think that Japan, India are subordinate power, but they want the United States to treat them as a co-equal. But history is not necessarily a guide for the future, you know? So when I spoke in Beijing, I was quite frank to my Chinese friend. I say, you know, my reading of the history leads me to believe that you are a benign power, but history is not necessarily a guide to the future. And there are trouble aspects of your contemporary behavior. South China Sea being an example. You know, I was very frank with them. I said, we are not sure how a rich and powerful China will behave. Will you behave as a historical China, the Tang Dynasty, when China was the greatest civilization in the world, had no colony, no intent to have conquer anybody, overall anybody, or will you be a different China? I said, we in Southeast Asia are not sure. We are watching you carefully. We are watching your behavior in the South China Sea carefully. We are not sure whether you are a status quo power, whether you abide by the rule of law, or once you have achieved great power status, you will behave just as Western great powers have behaved throughout history. So.
Thank you. Very helpful. Should we go to questions?
Let's go to questions.
Yeah. We'd like to invite questions from our students, and for our other invited guests, the only ground rules are that you identify yourself by name, what you're studying, and there'll be a question mark attached to the end of what you ask. And we have microphones. There's a question right in the side there, right in the back. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon. Bruno Verdini, PhD student at MIT. Related to the conversation this afternoon, Ambassador Koh, how do we work to increase the chances for international law to succeed? Some constraints, some enhancers. Under what conditions can it make an even bigger difference in our world?
Right. Thank you. So the question is, how can we enhance?
Yes.
Right?
How can we enhance the effectiveness of
On
international law
international
and make it successful? We've
Yeah.
talked about a couple of examples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are two views. There are two views in my country, Singapore, about international law. There's a realist view is that all great powers have an opportunistic attitude towards international law. They will rely on international law when it's convenient and ignore it when it's not convenient. And they often cite the record of the United States to vindicate this case. And I'm sorry to be critical, but it's true. If you look at the record of the United States, right, the United doesn't have a perfect record of. I think it's Bill Clinton or Madeleine Albright once said in a famous statement that we will always act in our national interest. We will do so in accordance with the law, if possible, and if not possible, we'll act alone. This tends to be the attitude of great powers. But I would say, as a soft realist, I'm not a hard realist. As a soft realist, I say that whether great powers or small power, it is in your self-interest to live in an orderly world rather than a chaotic world. It is in your self-interest to live in a world where there are rules than in a world where there are no rules. It is in your self-interest to even accept the adverse finding of a third party than not to do so. Let me give an example. I was a member of 3 dispute panels for the WTO. The first case was a very difficult one, and I must say I take my hats off to Sir Leon Britton. He was the EU Trade Commissioner. He was a tough guy. He took the United States to dispute settlement in WTO on the ground that your Helms-Burton Act contravened WTO law. This is America has an irrational policy towards Cuba. Yeah? Totally irrational. You have in place 50 sanctions against Cuba for 50 years. 50 years. Makes absolutely no sense. But anyway, it's a very emotional issue. There's a significant refugee community in Florida, and your Cuba policy seems to have been hijacked by this interest group rather than by rational consideration. So you have a law in your books, the Helms-Burton Act, which enables the United States to punish foreign companies that trade with Cuba or uses property expropriated from Americans. The EU took America to WTO. And the WTO empaneled a dispute panel. It's always 3 people. This is hot potato, So the former Director General of WTO, Arthur Danko, agreed to be a member. Then they asked a New Zealander, trade expert, to be the second. And then they asked me, we're desperately looking for a sacrificial lamb, a third party. Can you be the third member? And I asked my Prime Minister, they said yes. I asked Prof. Chan in Washington, they said yes. So we were in panel, but Sir Leon Britton was actually making use of us. The clock started ticking. He was using the dispute settlement process to put pressure on the United States to settle. And so before the clock ran out, the United States and EU arrived at a compromise. Yeah. Give you a second example. Australia and New Zealand brought a trade complaint against the United States. Australia and New Zealand exported lamb meat to the United States, which the domestic industry felt was injuring their interests. And the United States tried to invoke the safeguard law to protect the domestic industry. So Australia and New Zealand took the case to WTO, and Australia, New Zealand, and the United States asked me whether I was willing to be the chairman of the dispute panel. I'm not a WTO expert, I know nothing about lamb meat, but I thought, well, if I can be useful to the WTO, why not? So there are three of us. We found that the United States had violated WTO law because the US domestic safeguard law was not consistent with the WTO safeguard instrument. The United States appealed against us to the appellate body. The United States lost the case. So the question is, the United States is a very powerful country. The two countries that won, Australia and New Zealand, are not powerful countries. The United States could have just ignored the WTO decision and walk away. But did the United States do that? It did not. It complied. It amended your domestic law to conform to WTO law. Why? You ask yourself why. Why would a powerful country do that? I say because it is in the American interest for the WTO dispute settlement process to work. Because you are often the complainant. You complain against China, complain against many countries, and if you walk away, you set a very bad precedent for others. So by accepting an adverse verdict, you are validating an institution and a process. So my argument is, very often, a powerful country, it serves the long-term interests of a powerful country to comply with international law, Now, you may say this is an easy case, trade law. What about use of force? Well, I did a study once on the use of force, and I said, I have a whole catalog to share with you. North Korea invaded South Korea. But did it succeed? No, it was rebuffed. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and wanted to incorporate Kuwait as a province of Iraq. The United Nations opposed this, and there was a coalition of like-minded countries that repelled the aggression. The United States invaded Vietnam. Did the United States succeed? I'd say no. The Russians invaded Afghanistan. Did the Russians succeed? I would say no. The United States invaded Iraq. The United States withdrawn from Iraq. So I'm not against the use of force. I'm not a pacifist, I'm not a pacifist. I do believe in a good war. But I want to make a minor point that there are limits to the efficacy of the use of military power. Yeah. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Hello, a student studying at the Kennedy School. You suggested that Korea, Japan, and China bring their island disputes to the ICJ. One factor that is preventing the Dokdo case from being brought to the ICJ is a perception among the Korean public that if we bring the case to the ICJ, we may lose because there is a Japanese judge that has ties to the imperial family. Do you think, you mentioned in the last session that Confucianist countries may have a reluctance to bring friends to court. Do you think there is a mistrust in general among Asian countries about the arbitration process? And if so, how can we dispel such a perception?
Yes. It is true that there is a Japanese national on the bench of the International Court of Justice, a very good friend of mine actually, Hisashi Owada, and there is not a Korean national on the bench. But if you bring the case to ICJ, you'll be compensated, you know. If you don't have a national on a court, you are entitled to appoint an ad hoc judge. It could be a Korean, or you could appoint me. Or anybody, yeah. So, I mean, so when Malaysia and Singapore brought Pedro Branca to the court, neither of us has a national on the court. So we appointed an American, we appointed an Indian, Rao, and I think Malaysia appointed a South African, South African. When we brought a case to the other court in Hamburg, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, Malaysia and Singapore did not have judges on the court, and under the rules, we were entitled to appoint one each, and we appointed an American, Bernie Oxman, and the Malaysians appointed a Bangladeshi. But you know, I have confidence in the. Okay, I take back what I say about very little integrity in the world. Huh? I would say that when people are elected as judges, whether to the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or other courts, most of them are honorable people. Most of them honor. Most of them would try their level best to be fair, you know. And collectively, whether it's a panel of 15 judges at ICJ or 21 at ITLOS, collectively, I think you get justice, you know. We have appeared before both ICJ and ITLOS. Whenever you go to court, you never know what the verdict is. And before I went to receive judgment in an ICJ case, my government asked me, what's likely to be the outcome? I said, I don't know, you know. And I had a press conference, you know. I had a press conference. So the press asked me, what is the ICJ likely to rule? So to protect myself, I said, well, the court could rule in one of three ways. They could award Pedro Branca, Middle Rocks, and South Ledge to Malaysia, and we lose everything. The court could award Pedro Branca, Middle Rocks, South Ledge to Singapore, we win everything. Or it could be a split decision, yeah? That the court could award Pedro Branca to either Malaysia and Singapore, and the smaller features, Middle Rocks, to the other party. And that's what happened, you know. So when the judgment came down, we were all surprised because we thought that these features go together as a grouping. I mean, they're geomorphologically the same, you know. And yet the court decided to award Pedro Branca to Singapore and the two little rocks, Middle Rocks, to Malaysia. In a way, it was a good outcome because it enabled me to say that it was. I wanted to appease Malaysian public opinion. A country that loses a case usually get very upset, you know. So I told my Singapore friend, please don't dance in the street and no champagne to be uncorked. We should be very restrained. And our public rhetoric should be that it was a fair and balanced judgment. Yeah. And so when the Malaysians said it was a fair outcome, each side got something, I did not contradict them. I said, yes, it's true. It's true. So
I think it's very positive, Tommy, that we're going to leave here with a more positive view of human nature than we had. Professor Graham Allison and I visited the World Court of Arbitration and the International Court of Justice in the Peace Palace in The Hague a month ago this weekend. And it's a stark reminder about to us, all of us, about some of the issues we've been talking about, Japan, China, the US, China, because Andrew Carnegie built it. It's a beautiful building in 1913, in the belief that the great powers of 1913 were so sophisticated and refined that they would agree to arbitration rather than war. The primary backer of Andrew Carnegie was Tsar Nicholas II. of Russia. And his portrait, a beautiful portrait of the Tsar, hangs in the Peace Palace. And of course, the great irony is that a year later, the great powers did not choose arbitration, they chose war. And so that gives us a way to think about the impact of history on this very complex subject. We have time for one more question. It's only fitting that our partner and friend, Professor Bob Mnookin, ask it.
Thank you for a marvelous presentation. My question really relates to something. My question builds on something you said, and it relates to what you've talked about before. My perception is the possibility of arbitration or adjudication of boundary disputes between nations can be done quite effectively. The norms aren't entirely clear, but there are norms. They can be applied through an adjudicatory process. Do you think the same is true in irredentist situations? I'm thinking of Crimea, where a great power thinks it has vital interests at stake. There are ethnic nationals in part of another nation, and they're prepared to violate Westphalian norms where there isn't any institutional mechanism to enforce those norms. So I guess my question is, do we have to be a little more precise about what our aspirations for the rule of law should be? Or do you think the aspiration should be to build institutions that might really do something, but then it's a little bit like someone says, how many troops does the Pope have? Who's going to use force?
All right. Let me answer your question in a roundabout way. So far, nobody's asked me about my work as a special envoy for the UN in making peace between Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1993. And maybe we should ask ourselves, is there any lesson that can be extrapolated from that experience in 93 to Ukraine, Crimea, 2014? I would say, number one, that the world in 1993 and the world in 2014 are fundamentally different. I would say that Russia in 1993 and the Russia of today are fundamentally different. Russia in 1993 was weak. Economy was in shambles. You had a president, Boris Yeltsin, who was physically frail, who was pro-Western. I mean, he wanted actually to be accepted by the West. And because he needed help, he was willing to be cooperative in settling the disputes with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I was lucky because I was a special envoy during that window when it was possible to close a gap between the two sides. But I also told the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian that this window will close, that Russia will be strong again. And you should waste no time in joining NATO, and as soon as you qualify, join the EU, which they did. But I also gave them another advice, which did not go down very well. I told them there are 50,000 Russian pensioners and families in Estonia, and there are 20,000 Russian military pensioners and family in Latvia. I pleaded on their behalf. I want to tell you one wonderful story. In both Estonia and Latvia, I met everybody, including the Russian veterans. I had a meeting with them, and I heard them out. I promised to advocate their cause to the host country. And at the end of the meeting, this ex-Russian general stood up and saluted me, and said, "Sir, I'm a good communist, but if I were not, and I believe in God, I will invoke the Almighty's blessings on you." I say, wow, I will report this to my Christian wife. But my serious point is that Estonia and Latvia has suffered terribly during Stalin. Stalin tried to extinguish the intelligentsia of both countries. 1/3 of the adult population of both countries were deported to Siberia. So you can imagine the bitterness. So when I preach forgiveness, when I urge them to forgive the sins of Stalin, when I urge them to look to their future, when I told them that Russia will be strong again, and that if you don't treat these Russian settlers well, they could be a future problem for you, because the Russian doctrine of near abroad is a very dangerous doctrine, you know. Can you imagine the Chinese having a doctrine of near abroad? But it was a very difficult plea for the Estonian and Latvian to receive, because they were so embittered, you know. Ukraine and Crimea in 2014 is not Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in 1993. Russia is today strong and rich, and you have a leader that is not interested in courting the West, but in opposing the West. And if you look at the makeup of Ukraine is almost divided down the middle into two equal halves. The western part of Ukraine, Roman Catholic, pro-EU. Eastern half of Ukraine, Orthodox, many of them Russian-speaking, pro-Russia. It is clear to any objective observers that Ukraine can only survive as a united whole if we're equally friendly with Russia and with the EU. And for leaders, I mean, Yanukovych wanted the country to be close to Russia and distant from the EU. Those who opposed Yanukovych wanted the other way. Neither part was possible. I mean, if you ask me if we can, reverse time, I wish Ban Ki-moon or somebody had intervened in the middle of the crisis before Yanukovych was forced to flee, and say to all Ukrainians, the only way for you to survive as an independent, sovereign state with your territorial integrity intact is to be a neutral country, is to be neither aligned with the EU nor with Russia. And maybe the best option would have been to convene an international conference, to guarantee the territorial integrity, sovereignty in Ukraine, but also for the Ukrainian to undertake that they will be a neutral country, But that did not happen. Unfortunately, they were torn apart by those who wish to be close to the EU and those who be close to Russia. And I'm not sure what can be done now, I think that was a missed opportunity.
So we've come virtually to the end of our time here, but I want to call a couple of things to people's attention. When Nick raised the South China Sea and the East China Sea, situations with great potential for escalation, notice how Tommy answered. He started off putting it in a larger context, policy context, history context, cultural context. He didn't go right to the immediate conflict, but how can we surround this? Then methodically going through a series of options, conciliation, arbitration, adjudication, and then a look back at past agreements that if revived, maybe if we can calm things down, or a nice way out. Then to past practice, which was to kind of treat it as an ambiguous zone, and then gently to a series of other analogous Asian examples where countries had faced exactly such situations with high escalation potential. And what's so interesting is some might say this was simply talk it to death, which is probably good. but providing any number of ways that as tempers cool, directions that could be very peaceful. And I think it's very helpful to see that rather than jump right to the conflict, as many people I think tend to do. I would also notice when you were talking about the Ukraine, I guess before you started, your opinion of human nature had soared, and it may have just plummeted. But but also speaking of the importance of forgiveness, and that's easily underrated, I think. But the difficulties are very clearly acknowledged in the Baltics, as you said. But again, something from the first session, there was a moment to be seized when the Ukraine could have taken another path, not merely by its own actions, but by some very effective outside actions. Could have, not really sure. So we put these really tough war and peace kind of issues back to where we started with trade. And you see many examples of conflict management, resolution, lots of different ways, but as well, negotiations, not so much just across the table, but you yourself used a term that we favor when we talk about multi-front negotiation campaigns. And partly that's to build alliances, and partly it's to anticipate potential opponents and blockers and to act to avert those. You talked about strategic clarity. Singapore wanted a free trade agreement, very clear on that, but highly opportunistic behavior to seize that and turn it into a reality. And before you and I have gone back and forth about the role of luck, which you acknowledge strongly, but in the presence of careful preparation, often things can break your way. So whether it's negotiation campaigns or these very, very tough conflict situations, I think our audience, and certainly Nick, myself, my program on negotiation colleagues and students, have a lot to think about, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful job. Congratulations on your award.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Did a great job. Thank you. Really learned a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. Bob.
That was great.